Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast. Over the years, there have been active voices in society that have long held that Earth is overpopulated. We don't have the space or the resources to adequately provide for the needs of every person in the world in a sustainable, equitable manner. If current population trends continue, those voices may well get their wish. But that raises some really interesting challenges for us, and that is what we're going to discuss today. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host Michael Howard, the head of marketing at InfoTools. Today we're joined by Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, co-author alongside John Ibbotson of Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline. Thanks for joining us on the show, Darrell.
Well, thanks for having me on World Population Day. So you picked the right topic and the right day.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. On that, what is the most significant thing that you're going to share with us today?
Well, the idea that the global population is going to continue to expand forever is just simply not true. That probably what's going to happen is we're today about 8 billion people. We'll see what the UN tells us with their new estimates that'll be coming out shortly. About 8 billion people. The likelihood that we're going to get anywhere close to the 11.4 billion or 11.2 billion that they told us about 5 or 6 years ago that we would be getting to is simply not accurate. What we're going to do is we're going to get to the probably 2040s, the population is going to peak somewhere around 9 billion or lower, and then it's going to start to decline. And how far down it goes, nobody really knows. That's the most shocking thing that I'm going to tell you today.
Okay, so in the introduction, I mentioned those who were pro-population decline. To begin with, I guess, what are some of the benefits of a shrinking population?
I think anything that relates to the environment, if you believe, as I do, that human activity does have an effect on the climate and the environment in general, fewer people on the face of the earth you would have to see as a good thing. But everything that relates to the economy is going to be a lot more challenging than it is today.
No, for sure. So you quoted in the book I mentioned Italy's health minister, Beatrice Lorenzin. We are a dying country. That sounds rather apocalyptic. Was there truth in her statement? What kinds of negative impacts, I guess, are we likely to face with such decline?
Okay, so Italy's an example, but we could just as easily pick Korea, we could pick Japan, we could pick China, we can pick any number of probably about 30 countries that are absolutely losing population today. So Italy, it's somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people that depart their population through the way that we all depart the population every year. Their median age in Italy, or actually, median age, so half the population's older, half the population's younger, is 48. So that means that even if Italy wanted to try and change its population pattern by having more children, there simply aren't the people in the population in that stage of life in which they have the type of fertility that you need to have in order to increase the population. They're really not in the population. So Italy is on a sliding decline that will only accelerate over time. But as I said before, so are many other countries.
So 48 age, how does that compare to other countries that may have a steady population and then some have a growing?
Yeah, the steadier type of population is probably like the United States, where the median age is 38.
Okay.
So a whole decade older in Italy. But if you went to Spain, if you went to Portugal, if you went to Greece, you'd see a very similar pattern. Go to Japan, the median age today is 48, and they lose about 1 million people from their population every year.
Yes, and I'm assuming that there's death that contributes to that, but also migration as well. So do you
No,
tend
in
to
Japan,
no?
it's almost exclusively deaths. Same thing in Italy, it's almost exclusively deaths. So when you have an older population, and particularly in places like Italy, it's the oldest part of the old population that's the most rapidly growing. You get into a situation where the number of deaths just continue to outpace the number of births, which is why you have the decline. You can compensate with it for it to a certain extent, as New Zealand does and Australia does, and as my country does, Canada, through immigration. But that's not a long-term solution,
No.
because the places that are all the sources of immigrants in the world these days are also going through very similar trends. So even a place like India, its population is a lot younger than it is in say, for example, Italy, but the fertility rate of India has now dropped below, or of India has dropped below replacement rate. So for how much longer they're going to be a source of immigrants, difficult to say.
Mm. Okay, so if we think about this from a socio perspective, how will shrinking populations impact the way we relate to one another, the social constructs, relationships we have in society?
Well, what you're going to see is economies all over the world that are going to struggle to be able to produce things. Now, I know, and actually produce things, but even more importantly, to consume things. And if our economy is dependent on consumption, it doesn't matter if you bring technology into the process of creating more goods, in particular consumer goods. If you don't have a group of the population that's there to buy them, the economy won't continue to grow. And it's not just the size of the population that has an effect on that; it's the age of the population. So not only is the population going to peak and start to shrink, it's aging as we go through that. And older people tend not to be big consumers of consumer goods. So what we're going to be challenged with is economic contraction. And you're also going to be seeing, you were talking about how we're going to relate to each other. You're going to see shifts in power structure in the world based on population size. So the African population continues to grow, at least for the next while. It's going to continue to grow, whereas countries like China are going to lose half of their population over the course of this century. So we're going to start to see shifting power dynamics. By the way, similar in places like Russia, where they're seeing a declining population now too.
Mm. So, I mean, thinking about China, for instance, so much of the world relies on goods that are manufactured there, gives us like relatively good cost or prices for things that we want and desire. Like having half the size of its population, that's significant, isn't it?
Well, it's going to be significant because their workforce is shrinking dramatically. So what you're going to start seeing is companies start to offshore some of their production out of China, because the Chinese labor force is going to grow expensive as it shrinks, and they're going to take it to places, for example, like India. So the question in a place like India is, how rapidly can you improve the infrastructure that you need in order to have successful manufacturing and to offload some of that capacity to China? And it's a similar kind of question in Africa, for example. Hello in New Zealand. Good to see you.
School holiday time, so our
That's all
youngest
right. Say
Darcy.
hello from Canada. Yes. But the Africa is going to be a very interesting case in point, because, as I said before, they have a growing population and a young population, but they don't have the educational capacity. They don't have the infrastructure. And they don't even have, like, for example, the legal regularity to be able to accommodate the type of manufacturing capacity that you would have in China moving over to Africa. So there's going to be a lot of challenges that are going to be related to the manufacturing capacity in China declining. Maybe you're going to see even more of an emphasis on onshoring manufacturing capacity in a place like, for example, like New Zealand, because the population is going to be able to sustain itself for longer, because it's actually over time, because its ability to in bring in immigration, it's going to be able to continue to grow its population, whereas China is going to shrink.
Hmm. So, country branding is obviously going to play a big part in the world to try and, I guess, attract people, to keep people staying in the country as well. So, New Zealand, I think, just recently announced we had the first net or zero negative population growth, more people heading out of the country than in. So, that's quite significant too. But if we can hold on
Yeah,
to those, that will definitely help.
yeah. Well, it's what we're going into is a conversation about the structure of population, the size, the age, the distribution of the population, which is something that we pretty much take for granted. and we pretty much take for granted that that is either going to remain constant or continue to accelerate or continue to grow. But John Ibbotson and I wrote Empty Planet because we know that that's not going to be the case. So what we tried to do is to share with people what the actual structure of the population is going to be going forward, and basically putting out a warning there that we've got to get ready for a world that's going to be very different.
Mm. So if we think about the political ramifications, then booming populations obviously have a larger representation of younger voters who are able
Mhm.
to use their votes to influence the makeup of government, etc. Shrinking populations, obviously, there's a larger percentage of those in the older cohorts. So the younger, their vote will be diminished moving forward. What other kinds of political implications are there for smaller populations?
Well, the single biggest one is what the demand is going to be for public services. Pardon me. So if you have an aging population, particularly things like long-term care are going to be an issue. You're going to see an increasing demand for that,
Mm,
as opposed to a focus on early childhood education. So scarce public resources are going to be demanded by the aging population that also disproportionately participates in election campaigns and through the process of voting. Now, in some countries like Australia, for example, where they have mandatory voting, it's probably not as big an issue. But when you look at who it is that our political system is going to favor, it's going to be older people because they're just more significant in the overall size of the population. So what they demand is what's going to be on the agenda. Pardon me.
yeah, and New Zealand, we don't have compulsory voting,
Yeah.
um, and at domestic level elections, the turnouts can be quite low, which is a shame. But people are able to exercise that right not to vote. So yes, I guess we've got it coming if we're not prepared to share our views and votes.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely you get what you vote for, and what we know is older people tend to be organized and they tend to vote. So
Mm,
the demand on public services is going to be directed by them. Pardon me. As I said, things like long-term care, pensions, everything that relates to aging, protecting things, for example, like equity in homes.
mm,
As younger people, and we see this all over the world, there's a huge demand for increasing the amount of housing stock that's available. Well, obviously, older people are going to have a view on that. Younger people may have a different view on that. So generational politics could become more of an issue going forward.
mm. Okay, and we touched on it earlier as well, but I guess there still could be more. The economic the economic angle, what's at stake for smaller populations from a financial perspective?
Well, it's really problematic for smaller populations because they're so reliant on international trade. So it depends on the resources that are in place, and it depends on the ability to generate your own income in your country to be able to insulate yourself from what's going on in terms of global population patterns and changes that are going to be happening geopolitically. So I think that there's going to be an awful lot of interesting conversations on population issues that are going to be more, I would say, political in nature and more animated, I would say, going forward. Like one of the biggest conversations that we have today is over immigration. So what is the place of immigration in terms of population policy in a place like New Zealand? It's going to be very interesting.
Mm, yeah, and I mean on that, migration obviously, as we've said, is one solution, but it's not the silver bullet for declining populations. It obviously will just move the issue to another place. So countries like Canada, US, UK all have fast track visas for those under 35. I'm assuming that that age might be revisited at some stage as well. Um,
Yeah, I would suspect that there's going to be a whole lot of conversations about that. And the other public policy area where there's going to be a lot of conversation is on family policy.
mm,
because one of the we haven't talked about it yet, but the single biggest driver of the population change that we're talking about here is the fact that we've stopped having as many kids as we used to have. So if there will be attempts, and there currently are attempts being made by governments all over the world to try and find ways of increasing the number of children that are being produced by their populations, not in an assertive way in the sense that they're demanding that people do it. There are some countries that do, but more in the vein of trying to provide support for people who want to have kids.
Mm.
So there's going to be a pressure from a family policy perspective on those types of supports as well. The problem, of course, that when you read the book, you'll see this. The problem is that everywhere that that's been tried, it really doesn't work. I mean, and the reason is the single biggest reason we don't want to have kids is we just don't want to have kids.
Yeah. But potentially a tax break for every kid that you have.
Yeah, and there are countries that are doing that. So, I mean,
Mm.
if you take a look at the Nordic countries, there's a lot of that. If the country that's probably the most aggressive on this front at the moment is Hungary, where if you have 4 kids, you don't pay taxes for the rest of your life.
Oh.
And there's all sorts of incentives. But what's the effect been on fertility rates? The answer is none, or
Mm.
very little. And the reason is because I said, we'd like to think that the reason that people aren't having kids is because of market failure, right? So the idea that the incentive structures are incorrect, that, children are too expensive, so we have to make them less expensive, or that anything that relates to the incentive to have children, we can provide that, and people will make the decision that we feel is the one that we want them to make based on changing the choice options that they have available to them. But the truth is, if we said your kids were free, would you have 3 or would you have 4?
Mm.
And the answer is maybe some people would, but most people probably wouldn't. And the reason is most people aren't having kids. Is number one reason is, as I said before, they just don't want them. The second reason is they can't have them.
Mm.
And the reason for that is because they waited too long to start their families. So if you wait into, the average Canadian woman back in, and I'm sure it applies the same to New Zealand, it does to most Western countries, the average woman back at that time started her family in the early 1960s, started their family when they were probably around the age of 22, 21. When they started their family, they probably had their first child pretty early, and they probably had 3 or 4 during their lifetime. My mother, in the early 1960s had 4. That was the average in Canada. Today, the average Canadian woman gets married around the age of around 30, and if she has any children, she probably has 1. That's the most frequent number of children in any household in many countries.
Mm.
So that's the issue. I mean, we start late, and then we don't decide to have multiple kids. We only decide to have 1 or 2, and if you only have 1 or 2, the population doesn't grow. You need to
Yep.
have 3.
Because of other deaths before being able to have kids, etc.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's why.
Are there any other levers that countries can call on, I guess, to address the decline?
Well, the market failure ones are the best ones, and the 2 biggest ones that I can point to are making children as cost free as possible, and the other one is doing everything we can to reduce the effect of the motherhood penalty, and that's working women being penalized in their careers as a result of deciding to become mothers. But the effect of those things will be, as we've seen in all the countries where it's been tried, the effect of it is pretty marginal.
Mm.
It slows things down, but it doesn't reverse them.
I mean, with this as well, obviously the father plays a huge role in growing families, etc. Was there any studies as part of your research that looked and addressed that point as well?
Yeah, anything that creates an incentive for people, not an incentive, that reduce the penalties for having kids, that make it easier to have kids, all can have some marginal effect, but it doesn't reverse the situation. You're there's all sorts of reasons for doing these things, but if you believe that what you're going to do is you're going to affect fertility in your country, the evidence is that you really don't.
Mm, okay. One chapter that really stood out to me was around what is lost. Its title, the chapter's title, Cultural Extinction in an Age of Decline, was quite
Mhm.
stark. Can you talk us through this?
Well, one of the topics we looked at was indigenous populations in that particular circumstance. And most indigenous populations, like in New Zealand, it's about 15% is Maori. They have higher birth rate than average, but their birth rate's coming down too. And what's happening in terms of cultural extinction is that most of these cultures were not city-based cultures. They're cultures that are based out in the countryside. But what's happening with the Maori population is it's happening with the Aboriginal population in Indigenous population in Australia is it's urbanizing. And as it urbanizes, the ability to actually hang on to those things that make the culture, like the language, for example, become harder and harder. So the question, really, in terms of cultural extinction, is how do you hang on to the elements of a particular culture when it's being put in a place where those specific cultural artifacts, so for example, like language, aren't things that are as essential as they were, as there's an assimilation that takes place as people move into urban areas, because one of the biggest drivers of declining fertility actually is urbanization. So when we move from the countryside to the city, we make different decisions about our families, and but in particular, the lives of women change. And we talk about this in the book. But one of the other factors is what I just described about indigenous population and the effect that that has on cultural preservation. So that's what we were talking about.
Mm. Yeah, I'm really encouraged just to see how much of a, I guess, an effort New Zealand is making in that as well. So there's like Te Reo, which is the native language for Māori, um, is a national language, and so like you do see it quite publicly, which is I guess is a rarity if you look around the world as well.
Well, I can tell you, in Canada, there's been attempts to do this, but the indigenous population here in the country is actually quite small.
Mm,
There's been a lot of effort and a lot of focus on the indigenous issues in Canada over the space of the last decade. But the truth is, it's a pretty small population. It's rapidly urbanizing, and its fertility rate is aligning with the overall population in the country. And as it goes through the process of continuing to urbanize, because half the status Indian population in Canada actually doesn't live on reserves, um, uh, the ability to hold on to the culture is very challenging.
mm. So if we think about organizations now, big brands around the world, capitalism, if you will, shrinking population will mean a declining total addressable market, a customer base, if you will. So is it feasible that perpetual revenue growth, like we see in the world, will actually exist in the future? Or are we likely to see a shift in thinking here?
No, we're going to see revenue decline, and we're going to see the decline of economic growth because most of our increase in global economic activity since the end of the Second World War has been due to an increase in population. So we've gone from 1950 around 2 billion people in the world to last year 8 billion. Well, you want to understand what drives economic growth. That's what drives it. So when you start going in the opposite direction, why would you think that it would continue to grow? But companies are still, seeing a future in which it's going to be, growth is going to be driven by, uh, you know, uh, some activities that they're going to engage in. But it's really a zero sum game with their competitors because the overall market's not going to grow.
Mm.
I mean, everything from beverage alcohol to automobiles to whatever. I mean, they're all going to be challenged.
So you're probably likely to see mega companies, I guess, that are just have a foot in everything.
Yeah, well, because yeah, they're going to have to find different ways of doing things. But there will be some growth that comes out of things like, for example, pharmaceuticals.
Mm.
There will be some growth that comes out of providing certain types of services, like taking care of people in long-term care facilities, or however we're going to deal with that. Maybe it's more home care. There's going to be innovation that's going to relate to how what the structure of the population is and what the needs of that population structure in a certain way will be, but they're not going to be, we're going to build, we're going to grow next year because there's a more of a demand for, say, if you're not an automobile company, more of a demand for more net number of cars, because we have so many more kids being born and so many families being formed, and populations growing as a result of adding net number of people to the overall population. We're not going to be seeing that.
Mm.
I mean, it's going to continue for a bit of time, but it's 25 years, it's not going to be the case.
No, sure. So I guess that's one really, I guess one thing I love about humanity that whenever we are in a challenge, in a tight spot, there is that opportunity to innovate, to use our curiosity, and market research is no doubt play a big part in that as well, because we're the ones that can see these trends coming, can pick up this what's consumers, what people are thinking, etc., and like help to direct and move the industry.
Well, that's exactly what we're in the business of doing. I mean, the unique place that we are in the market in the market is that we're in direct contact with consumers. So, but not just consumers, with citizens. I mean, you can
Mm.
look at them in both ways, and as a result of that, because we're in direct contact, we're catching these changes happening in real time. And we can talk about assessing the needs of the population, whether it's for public services or whether it's for products and services. So, yeah, I think we're in a great position to be able to explain how this transition is taking place.
Mm. So, are there any ways that you're working with your colleagues in other lines of the business to help prepare for this, these shrinking populations?
Well, I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm writing about it and I'm thinking about it, but I'm also seeing other colleagues at Ipsos are also picking up the challenge. I mean, on the Ipsos Knowledge Center, you've probably seen all of the things that we've been putting together on generations. So even our CEO, Ben Page, is very interested in this topic. It's one of the priority areas of investigation for the company, and the Ipsos Knowledge Center has really picked up on this. And we have a fair amount of content there if anybody wants to take a look at it, about understanding the concept of generations and how they're going through transitions over as a result of population change. I think is really interesting, and it's new thinking. It's not just taking what other people have developed and trying to modify it. It's really new thinking that's taking place here at Ipsos. So I'm pretty impressed with what I've seen.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about with the population decline is the longevity. So average life expectancy is also increasing as well, but we haven't necessarily seen a legislated retirement age change, have we? There seems to be a lot of um, hesitation towards that, but it can definitely help with economies being productive, can't it?
Well, I mean, that is one of the solutions, is that people work for longer. And, given that we're living longer, maybe not healthy for a long time, but we're
Yes.
living longer. But the people who are living healthier, many of them want to continue to work. And that they're going to be an important resource in the marketplace. But, open office concepts don't work for them. Ambient noise drives them crazy, right? Uh, so we're going to have to think about how older people participate in the workplace, and it's not just about what the millennials think. In fact, there's not as many of them as we think there are. First of all, and the second thing is they're a lot older than we think what they are, and third thing is they don't have as much money as the older people do. Both as potential employees or ongoing employees, but also as consumers, more of a focus on the older group of the population may not be as fun for people to focus on, as focusing on what's new and hip and young, but that's the sweet spot in the economy.
Hmm. Yes, all very interesting things to discuss and to muse on. Um, any final words before we close, Darrell?
I think, Michael, the big thing for me, if there's a takeaway from all of this conversation, is um, uh, when you change the nature of people, you change the nature of everything. And when you change the structure of the population, everything changes as a result of that. So if you're not taking into account these really dramatic changes that are happening in terms of the population, you're probably missing what's really going on out there. I mean, this is the first generation, first couple of generations of any species in the world that has decided that Charles Darwin is wrong. That our primary goal is not to create the next better generation. Our view is, maybe not. And as a result of that, the implications of that in terms of the structure of our population, its distribution, its size, its age, are going to be really dramatic. And like many other things that we can look at in the world of projecting about the future, many of those things are really hypothetical. This one is not hypothetical. The decisions about what the size and structure of the population is going to be going forward have basically been already made. They were made by your grandparents, they were made by your parents, they were made by you. So what we're going to be doing is just living through the consequences of this. So I would really encourage people when they start thinking about the future, less flying cars and more about how we're going to get grandma to participate in the market economy, because that's really what we're going to be confronted with going forward.
Mm. Wow. Really nice words to close on. I thank you so much for sharing all of this, and hopefully we can get some good discussions coming out of it, and some good thinking, and some good actions to come out of it as well to help in this vein.
Well, thanks for having me on, Michael. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you to also those who have listened in today. If you have liked what you've heard, are interested about it, feel free to check out Darrell and John's book, Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline. It's available on Amazon, so feel free to give that a Google if you want to, or search. We'd also appreciate you sharing this podcast with others, subscribing to the podcast and leaving a review as well. It helps us to share the discussions that we have with others around the world as well. So with that, thank you for listening too. Now that's significant.